It's frightening how long one night can last. Judy hadn't slept well for almost 25 years. Yeah, she was a successful woman by all accounts. She had a husband, 3 beautiful children, and a thriving law practice. She had pretty much achieved the American dream. But she just couldn't sleep, and those long nights haunted her. Perhaps it was the quiet. You can stay busy as much as you can work, you can take care of a family, but at the end of the day, we all have to lie down in the silence of the night. And it was the quiet that bothered her. In that silence she thought, and in the dark she dreamed, and it all seemed so cold at times. Oh, she knew what it was, all right. And although her doctor had prescribed various sleeping medications for her, she was restless, and at times she was very much afraid. 25 years ago in law school, she became pregnant. It just wasn't planned. It wasn't the time for a baby, so she did what she really didn't want to do. She had an abortion. Oh, it didn't take long, and she didn't even have any of the rather common complications such as bleeding, infection, even sterility. Well, she finished law school, she got married, had 3 beautiful children, all of them planned, all loved, all well cared for. But still, she just couldn't sleep, and it was beginning to cause her serious problems. Her blood pressure was increasing. She became sick more often because her immune system wasn't as strong as it should be. She was frequently depressed. She was frequently anxious. Yet she was so successful. That day, so many years ago, haunted every day of her life, but especially her nights. In the silence of the night, she couldn't escape the inescapable. She wondered what her daughter would have looked like. Would she have been pretty, intelligent, filled with laughter on a warm, sunny day? Would she have been a good swimmer like her mother? How many times poor Judy had agonized about her unborn daughter's first day of school, her graduation from high school, college, graduate school. You would never know this bright, beautiful, successful woman was so filled with anguish. But she was strong and she handled it. For a while. How many cold, interminable nights of inescapable pondering it had taken to finally put her in the hospital. The tragedy of abortion has immediate and long-term consequences. Immediately, of course, the unborn child is killed. If the mother escapes complications, which they often don't, she inevitably has to face her memories and her thoughts in those long, silent, cold, haunting nights. In the silence of the night, reality asserts itself. Society itself faces consequences as the result of every unborn child killed. Subsequent generations are deprived of scientists, doctors, inventors that could have solved so many of the world's problems, alleviated so much of the world's suffering. In parts 1, 2, and 3 of our series, Abortion, the Truth and the Hope, we talked about the dark and twisted logic of abortion, the subversion of authentic law by the Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade, and the profound social, economic, and political consequences of 4 decades of abortion on demand, and the tens of millions of innocent human beings denied their potential. It's a dark blight on the history of mankind, and after centuries of science, religion, and experience, today's men and women are far more culpable than those of bygone days. In the face of this terrible tragedy, is there hope for the future? Well, the answer, of course, is yes. As long as we have breath, we have hope. Abortion and the pro-death mentality is doomed in virtue of its own position. That's the hope for the future. I can tell you this, my friends, without any fear of being wrong. This pro-death mentality, the abortion generation, is going to pass. The inner logic and the inner truth of the life and death struggle will assert itself. Those in favor of abortion on demand are not going to be reproducing themselves anywhere near as much as those in favor of life. That's a fact. The people that are in favor of artificial contraception, and by the way, abortion is the final frontier of contraception. It's the last-ditch effort to fix a problem. The inner logic of it is they cease to exist. Eventually, the politicians who are in favor of these things and those that think like them will contracept themselves into sterility and abort themselves into oblivion. And life will go on. Those in favor of life and a pro-life position will have been patiently and with dignity having their families, raising their families, teaching their families, handing on these values, traditional values, and at the heart of that is the value of every human life, precious, unique, unrepeatable. Every human being is so different from every other one. Oh, yes, we're the same in many ways, but you know, every one of us has a unique fingerprint. And that's merely an external indication of the uniqueness of that individual person. Everyone, from the very moment of conception on, is unique, precious, and unrepeatable. And yet, tens of millions of times, these innocent, precious human beings have been terminated, removed, their potential snuffed out, and the impact on society has been profound, and we are beginning to really feel the impact of almost 4 decades of abortion on demand in the United States and throughout the world. Yes, in the end, the inner logic and truth, or lack thereof, of the pro-death position will result in its extermination. Beyond that, mathematics and demographics are beginning to assert themselves. You may not believe in God. You may not believe in organized religion. You may not believe in traditional morality, but you better believe in science and mathematics and demographics. You better believe in reality. Oh, the higher realities are spiritual and moral realities, but no less important are those things that face us every day. Societies that have a strong family life, a strong life ethic, are societies that go on. Societies that are closed in upon themselves, egocentric societies, societies that make laws and do things merely out of self-interest, convenience. Those societies wither up and die and are blown away by the winds of history. We are not reproducing ourselves in the Western world in sufficient numbers to ensure our way of life. In the United States, everyone knows the Social Security system is in trouble. Why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't it be? How can the generation that came after my generation support my generation, the baby boomers so-called? How can they support us when they've killed a third of their numbers by abortion? The mathematics of it will assert themselves even if you don't get the logic and the moral argument. Demographically, we are declining. Oh, of course, the subject of abortion is taboo, and we don't like to bring it up. Politicians don't like to say too much about it. Even religious leaders sometimes are very careful about it. They don't want to say too much lest they rile up the people. Don't rock the boat. When I ministered as a Catholic priest, I considered one of my foremost missions rocking the boat. It was amazing that frequently priests, ministers are chastised by their very own leaders and superiors because they preach about these things. A failure to preach about these things in this generation, I believe, is sin. Sin of omission. It's certainly not something that helps society. What helps society is telling the truth. What helps society is doing what we need to do to improve ourselves, to guarantee our survival. The birth rate in the Western world since 1973 and the passage or the Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade, the birth rate has almost been cut in half in the Western world. It's barely enough to guarantee replacement in many cases. And so Europe and the United States and Canada, if it wasn't for immigration, would be wasting away from the point of view of population. And if you don't have the people, you're not going to have the productivity. If you don't have the people, you're not going to have the ingenuity. If you don't have the people, you're not going to have the advancing technology and science. You're going to be deprived and diminished, and you're going to wither up, and you'll just be a note in history. And that's what's unfolding in the Western world today. And what about the legal prognosis for Roe versus Wade, for the pro-death position? Well, we said in the second segment of this series, when we talked about Roe versus Wade, that it was based on shaky legal grounds, to say the least. And I mentioned to you 10 points why Roe versus Wade should be rejected. These are just legal points. The major reason Roe versus Wade and everything associated with it should be rejected is common sense. The argument made by the pro-choice, so-called pro-choice forces is that it's not a human being. Listen, they are about as anti-science as a person who would take the position that the world is flat today. Science makes constant progress. Science has progressed tremendously since 1973 when Roe versus Wade came down. Science tells us that from the moment of conception, without any question, you have a human being. The entire genetic package is there. The argument that that humanity is based upon development is absolutely fallacious. The determination of whether or not it's a human being or not based upon development is nonsense. A 12-year-old child is not fully developed. Therefore, shall we have the right to kill it because it costs too much or is inconvenient? From the moment of conception, science tells us, if not logic and common sense, that you have a human being with unlimited potential, not a potential human being, a human being. If it's not human from the moment of conception, it will never be human. A human being with unbounded potential, each one unique, precious, and unrepeatable. And we would do well to remember that. Oh, the scientific arguments are very important. The mathematical arguments, the demographic arguments, the inner logic and truth of this argument, all of these things are very important. that we carry on the dialogue socially and politically is of paramount importance. The more we talk about this openly and with courage, forthrightly, the better. You know, you can make a very, very valid comparison. It has been made many times, but a very valid comparison between the situation we have with abortion on demand today and the decision Roe versus Wade. The parallels with slavery in the United States and the Dred Scott decision, that's been spoken about many times by many people, but it's valid. It's absolutely valid. If you wanted to cause a fight back in the mid to late 1800s, then start talking about the issue of slavery. Start talking about whether or not a person should have the right to subjugate another human being, and then they say, well, it's not really a human being. Why not? Because of its age? Because of the color of its skin? Because somebody else said so? The Supreme Court said black people were not fully human and therefore did not have full rights that should be accorded to a human being. They weren't citizens. They're not even human beings. They referred to them as that unfortunate race. That's the Supreme Court. They made a horrible mistake. A civil war was fought, and slaves were freed, and rightly so. Now, we have another tragedy, another human rights violation, another class of people subjugated, treated as though they were less than human, the unborn. Is it any less of a tragedy that we can kill the most innocent and the most defenseless of our brothers and sisters and call ourselves civilized? If we were to have eyes to see and ears to hear, we would be absolutely appalled. We would stand back in horror at the ghastly sight of what we have done in the last 4 decades. We don't like to talk about it because it's uncomfortable. We don't like to talk about it because it elicits a violent response very frequently. And so we're afraid to touch it. Politicians are afraid to risk their careers. Physicians, attorneys, the leaders of society, afraid to talk too much about it lest they be marginalized or dismissed as fanatics. And yet, real human beings are murdered in the most brutal and ghastly fashion by the thousands on a daily basis, and we call ourselves civilized. If we had eyes to see, what would we see? Because the babe in the womb is out of sight, does that make it easier? In ancient times, for matters of convenience, they would take babies and throw them off a cliff, usually the females. Barbaric. In our own time, communist China, where they've limited the population, thus limiting their potential, they would take a child, if they was born, they found out it was a girl, they'd take it out and put it along the road in the countryside. A friend of mine knows a physician. He couldn't have children, this physician and his wife. So they adopted a girl. That little girl was from China, mainland China. The religious sisters, the nuns that ran an orphanage, would go out along the road in the countryside on patrol, like army patrol. The nuns would patrol the roads and they'd find babies. Sometimes they'd find them alive. They would take them back to the orphanage. One of these little children was adopted by this physician and his wife. She's 12 years old now. One of the most beautiful, bright little girls you could ever imagine. And we would say, oh, how barbaric that they would put a little baby by the side of the road to die. A few days before that, that little baby was in the womb. And yet we could say you have the right to kill that child. Development is not the right criterion for determining whether or not it is a human being or not. That is a fallacy of epic proportions. From the moment of conception, the child is human, or it never will be. And if you take the position subjectively and arbitrarily that based upon some point in time, 30 days, 90 days, 120 days, it's human or it isn't, that's illogical, irrational, and barbaric. From the moment of conception, it is a human being or it will never, never, never be a human being. And yet, they are sacrificed by the tens of millions on the altar of convenience. And we've had thousands of years of experience of Christianity, of civilization, so-called, and because of that, having more knowledge, we have more responsibility, and hence we are more culpable for our actions. And actions have consequences. And as time marches on, the consequences become more dire. If we don't do something about this Holocaust, this horrible Holocaust of human life, then society as we know it will cease to exist. Because a lightning bolt will come down from God, maybe. But if not so dramatic, then mathematics and demographics will assert themselves. Civilizations that have anything other than a pro-life mentality are doomed. They wither up, they blow away, and they are replaced by those who do have a life ethic. In Europe, the average family has a birth rate of less than 2. The Muslim families are having 8 to 10 children. Do the math. Do the math. Europe, and soon America too, will have a very, very different complexion. Oh, you say that's all right? Well, it's all right if you don't mind your grandchildren living under Sharia law. They vote. They vote in France. They vote in England. The Muslim people, some of which are very good people, they vote. But their culture is very different. And the character of the world will be very different. Actions have consequences. You want to live as the me generation wanted to live, egocentrically, self-centeredly, then you can. What are the consequences? The generations that come after you will be disadvantaged. They'll be deprived. You don't have to believe the morality. Just believe the mathematics. We have to have more dialogue. In this dialogue, in greater education, and inspiration, there is hope. There is hope for the future. Listen, the outcome of this battle is guaranteed. We win. The pro-life forces win. They have to. They will win by default, if no other way. But we have to do what we can for more education. We have to personalize this argument. You know, the way this has been allowed to happen is by not talking about it. by keeping it locked up in a closet. It's the deep, dark secret of the human family. It is a child. It is not a choice. Do not allow the serpentine semantics of the pro-choice argument to sway you. This is a child, and we have to personalize the argument. And that child has unbounded potential, and the world limps through time and space because it has been deprived of so many that could have been so gifted. In the end, there is hope in healing and in mercy. Love is what will conquer these things. Even if you have the truth, you have to use it with precision, not like a blunt instrument, but in mercy and love, in healing is where our hope is. Millions and millions and millions of women have had abortions. We should love every one of them, and we should do what we can to support every one of them. I'm telling you, society is now beginning to feel the effects of almost 40 years of parents who have to live with the undeniable reality that they killed their children. What does that do to a father? What does that do to a mother? Is it any wonder that Prozac is one of the number one selling drugs in the world, and that antidepressants are among the top selling drugs in the world? Why? We have a depressed, anxious, burdened generation. And a contributing factor of that is the tens of millions of men and women who have been involved in this terrible travesty, this terrible human rights violation. But our hope is in forgiveness. Our hope is in love. Our hope is in mercy. You remember my friend Judy. Well, she spent almost an entire year of her life ultimately in a psychiatric hospital. Her nights, however, didn't get any shorter or less torturous. Eventually, she stopped eating, and she wouldn't respond even to her husband or children. One night at 11 p.m., a nurse's aide came on duty on the floor where Judy suffered. Francine Jenkins was a good Baptist lady. She laughed a lot, and she prayed a lot, too. Oh, she read the Bible all right, but she didn't hit you over the head with it. She was as practical as she was pious and kind. She knew you couldn't force religion, politics, or kindness down anybody's throat. She sat quietly by Judy's bed through the long hours of her tortured nights. Judy would cry, and Francine would pray and softly sing one or another of the old Negro spirituals she had grown up with. It's hard to believe the compassion and love certain human beings have. Perhaps it's because they've suffered so much themselves. Perhaps Francine had known many sleepless nights and had also had 1,000 tortured thoughts. Well, she in fact had. Many years previously, she had had an abortion, and she'd suffered both physically and emotionally because of it. She almost bled to death. Then she had to live with it. Oh, the physical problems, if you live through it, are alleviated rather quickly, usually. But then you have to live with the memory. Long, lonely, cold nights in the silence. Finally, she had the blessing to realize that her only hope was in mercy, the mercy of God. After all, Christians believe that God was so merciful that he gave his only Son to suffer and die for our sins. If God was merciful to Francine, then why couldn't she be merciful to herself, she thought. Well, she made a deal with God. and she believed her sins and her mistakes weren't bigger than God's mercy. The God who created the mercy is more merciful than our biggest sins. So Francine prayed one night, and she laid her hand, her kind and merciful hand, upon the head of poor Judy. Immediately, Judy cried a tidal wave of tears. In a flash of light, she realized what plagued her. Her heart was broken, and she repented. She knew without any question that her only hope for the future was in mercy. And she knew she would never hope in vain. The real hope for the future is the mercy that in the end is deeper and broader than justice. You know, I'd forgotten this story for many years until very recently when Francine, who had once been my housekeeper, did the same thing for me. Forgiveness is a mighty thing. Oh, I couldn't forgive myself for 1,000 things that I'd done in my life. Francine, so kind, so Christian, so compassionate. Yes, she taught me a lesson. And so now I can forgive myself. Our hope for the future is in the mercy and love of God and the love we have for each other. That and only that can bring peace where before there had only been agony and torment. May God grant you that peace, and may you share it with each other. God bless you.